Welcome to the Sleep Storyteller, where the shadows whisper, the walls remember, and the ordinary world fades into the extraordinary. Tonight you are invited to step inside a house unlike any other, a house that is alive, aware, and patient, and that has waited centuries to meet someone like Emma. Some houses remember, not the furniture, not the creaking floorboards, but the echoes of every life that passed through them. Laughter, fear, sorrow, and secrets pressed into every corner. Emma never believed in such things. When she arrived at the old, abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town, she expected dust, silence, and decay. What she found was far stranger. Shadows shifted when she wasn't looking. Whispers curled around her thoughts. Doors opened and closed on their own. Hallways stretched impossibly, and the very air seemed to test her presence. This was no ordinary house. It was a sentient entity, formed over centuries by absorbed memories, thoughts, and emotions. And now Emma had become a part of it. What followed was a journey through fear, strategy, and understanding. A battle of perception and willpower where shadows could strike, whispers could wound, and illusions could twist reality itself. Emma's survival depended not only on courage, but on knowledge, patience, and insight into a consciousness far older and more cunning than any human mind. This is her story. A descent into a house that remembers, a mind that thinks, and a girl who refused to be consumed. Each chapter will guide you deeper, where horror meets intelligence and suspense lingers long after the lights go out. Tonight, let the sleep storyteller lead you into a world where fear is alive and the mind is the battleground. Emma had always been drawn to old houses. Something about their creaking floors, dusty corners, and forgotten stories called to her in ways she couldn't explain. When she inherited the Victorian house on the edge of town, she thought it was a dream come true, a chance to live somewhere that felt alive with history, somewhere that carried secrets in its walls. The house sat atop a small hill, its weathered wooden siding gray with age, windows staring like blind eyes, over the quiet street. As she pulled into the gravel driveway that first evening, a chill ran down her spine, not entirely from the autumn wind. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched, though the street was empty. Emma dismissed it, telling herself it was just the excitement of moving in, the anticipation of decorating her new space. Inside, the house smelled of dust, cedar, and something faintly metallic like old coins buried in forgotten drawers. The floors groaned beneath her steps, the echoes stretching across the high ceilings and empty hallways. Each room she explored seemed to whisper fragments of conversations that had long since ended, children laughing, arguments broken off mid-sentence, footsteps retreating up the stairs. She laughed nervously at herself, imagining things, letting the shadows play tricks on her eyes. Yet as night fell, the first scratching began. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like fingernails grazing against plaster. Emma sat on the edge of the staircase, listening, convinced the sound came from the wind rattling the siding. But the scratches didn't move. They stayed, insistent, circling her bedroom walls. She lay down under the blankets, hoping sleep would take her quickly. But then she heard it, a whisper, so low she thought she might have imagined it. Emma. The sound was like someone exhaling directly into her ear. Her heart stuttered. "Hello?" she called, her voice cracking with fear and disbelief. Silence answered. Only the scratching continued, moving rhythmically, deliberately, as if following a pattern she couldn't yet understand. She stayed awake all night, eyes wide, listening. By morning, she felt as though the house had changed overnight. The corners seemed darker, the shadows longer, the air heavier. She shook it off and decided to explore more, thinking perhaps the rooms held loose floorboards or hidden nooks where mice or raccoons could be causing the noises. She opened cupboards, tapped the walls, checked the attic, even under the floorboards, but found nothing. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That evening she tried to read, hoping the familiar rhythm of words would drown out the whispers. She sat in the living room, a single lamp casting a warm glow, and opened a novel. For a while she was distracted, absorbed in the story of distant lands and heroic adventures. Then faintly the whisper returned. This time it was clearer. "Why did you come?" Emma froze, the book slipping from her hands. The voice was soft, almost intimate, yet chilling, like someone knew every corner of her mind. She told herself it was imagination, exhaustion, maybe the stress of moving. Yet deep down she knew that whatever it was, it had been waiting for her. Days passed, and the scratching grew louder, more frequent, following her through the rooms. At night, the whispers evolved, no longer simple words, but fragments of her thoughts, her memories, her fears. Things she had never spoken aloud were now voiced in the dark, as if the walls themselves had learned to read her mind. Sleep became impossible. Emma started leaving lights on, doors ajar, hoping that visibility would ward off whatever haunted the house. But the darkness came anyway, even in the light. Shadows stretched across walls, and the whispers no longer stayed behind the plaster. They moved, drifting from room to room, rushing past her like invisible hands. She began to see them too, shadows that didn't belong, flickers of movement in the corners of her eyes. When she turned to look, nothing was there. And then, for the first time, the scratches were beneath her feet, in the floorboards, circling her bed, as if whatever was in the house had emerged from its hiding place and was tracing her, marking her, claiming her attention. The fear in her chest grew unbearable. That night, she couldn't stay in her room. She fled to the living room, pulling blankets over herself on the couch, listening. And through the quiet, through the stillness, the whisper returned. One final time before dawn, you should have left. Emma shivered as the first pale light of morning crept through the windows. She didn't know what had been in the house, or if it had even been waiting for her specifically, but she felt it in every bone, in every shadow, in the tremor of her own heartbeat. She realized with a sinking certainty that the house had stories to tell, and now she was part of them. And they had only just begun. The morning sunlight felt hollow as it filtered through the tall, grimy windows of the old Victorian house. Emma sat on the couch, wrapped tightly in the threadbare blanket she had dragged from her bedroom, staring at the walls as though they could answer the questions clawing at her mind. The whispers hadn't come with the dawn, but the scratching remained. Soft, insistent tapping beneath the floorboards, as though something or someone was pacing just below. She had tried to convince herself it was the house settling, the inevitable sound of wood and plaster adjusting after decades of neglect. But every instinct in her body screamed otherwise. That day she resolved to explore the house fully, room by room, searching for the source of the disturbances, hoping logic would banish the terror. She started in the kitchen, A high-ceilinged room with faded floral wallpaper peeling at the edges and a sink that leaked slowly, leaving a dark, damp stain across the linoleum. As she moved from cupboard to cupboard, her fingers brushing over dusty plates and glassware, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, studying her reactions, learning how she moved, how she breathed. She found nothing out of place, yet a chill persisted, trailing her like a shadow she couldn't escape. The day wore on, and Emma's exploration became more desperate, more frantic. She checked the pantry, the attic, even the narrow storage closet under the staircase, tapping each wall and floorboard, listening for hollow sounds, for the telltale scratch of fingernails against plaster. And every time she thought she had finally uncovered a logical explanation, she was confronted with the impossible. The whispers returned. They were faint at first, almost drowned by the ticking of the old kitchen clock, but then clearer. "You shouldn't have come here. It's too late now." Emma froze, her hand hovering above a chipped ceramic bowl. Her breath caught in her throat. She had no idea where the voice had come from, yet it carried the intimate knowledge of someone who had been inside her head for years. Panic prickled at her skin. For the first time she wondered if the house itself was alive, not with life, exactly, but with memory, intent, and malice. That night she decided to light every lamp in the house, illuminating the corners, the hallways, the dark spaces where shadows gathered. But the light did little to soothe her. The whispers became persistent, insistent, and maddening. They didn't speak in words anymore. They spoke in fragments of her thoughts, half-forgotten memories, fears she had never admitted to anyone. They recalled the times she had lied, the moments she had felt shame, the tiny betrayals of her own conscience. Emma pressed her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth on the couch, hoping the familiar rhythm of sound would block out the impossible intrusion. But the whispers found their way through her skull anyway. And then the shadows began to move. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, the flicker of lamps in old glass. But the movements were deliberate, patterns in the corners of her vision that resolved only when she looked away. She could feel them now, the presence behind her, circling, waiting, patient, like a predator that knows you're aware of it and is enjoying the fear it elicits. By the third night, she could no longer remain in the living room. Every room she moved into, the whispers followed. She tried sleeping in different corners, on the floor, even under the staircase, but the feeling of being haunted was inescapable. The scratches grew bolder, louder, tracing the walls, the floorboards, even the ceiling in patterns that made her skin crawl. Emma began noticing small things, objects she hadn't moved appearing in different places, shadows, lingering longer than they should, and the unmistakable sensation that the house itself was breathing around her. She started jotting notes in a journal, trying to make sense of what was happening. Names of rooms, times, the patterns of scratches, the words whispered to her, half hoping that recording them would somehow diminish their power. But the journal only seemed to encourage the presence, as if it relished her attempts at understanding. She found herself drawn to the attic again, the place that had seemed empty and benign when she first explored it. This time she noticed the smell of old wood, dust, and something more metallic, more urgent, almost blood-like. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and a cold draft surged out, carrying the faintest whisper, "You're not welcome here." Emma's hands shook as she stepped inside. The attic was filled with remnants of the past, broken furniture, stacks of yellowed newspapers, boxes of photographs, and long-forgotten toys. She felt a pulse of sorrow and anger, emotions not her own, radiating from the objects. It was as though the house had memories, emotions, and it was projecting them through the walls, the floor, the very air. She crouched to examine a photograph of a family, their faces pale, eyes hollow, smiling in a frozen moment of happiness that now seemed sinister. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, chaotic, almost pleading. Go, go, leave, stay. Her mind spun. How could she leave when she didn't know where the house ended and she began? The attic seemed to pulse with life, shadows stretching, shapes forming, twisting like smoke. The scratches became scratches and thuds, sounds moving beneath her feet, climbing up the stairs, filling the room, surrounding her. She realized with a sickening clarity that the house wasn't merely haunted, it was conscious, and it knew she was aware. The very air seemed to thicken, pressing down on her lungs, weighing on her skull. Panic surged. She scrambled to leave, tumbling down the attic stairs, heart hammering, ears ringing with whispers now shouting in her mind, "You belong here. You belong here." Emma collapsed on the living room floor, clutching her head, tears streaming. The sun had not yet risen. Her body shook from exhaustion and terror, but the house did not relent. It whispered, scratched, moved, and somewhere deep within the walls something waited, something that had been waiting for her from the moment she crossed the threshold. That night Emma sat in the center of the living room, lights on, blankets around her, mind racing, eyes darting to every shadow. She knew that the house was no longer just a building. It was a presence, a predator, an entity aware of her every thought. And as the first streaks of morning light crept through the windows, she understood something terrible. Leaving was no longer an option. The house had chosen her, and whatever lived within it had plans far beyond her comprehension. The whispers subsided for a moment, as though satisfied with the terror they had inflicted. But Emma knew, with a certainty that chilled her blood, that this was only the beginning. The house had a story, and she had become a part of it. And the story had just started to speak. The days blended together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Emma could no longer tell where the house ended and she began. Every corner she turned, every creaking step she took, was accompanied by whispers that spoke to her in tones she could not ignore. They were no longer just fragments of thoughts or memories. They had become conversations, urgent and demanding, as if the walls themselves had grown impatient with her hesitation. She began to notice patterns in the sounds, faint knocks at irregular intervals, a scratching that started at the corner of a room and moved toward her as she walked, and the occasional low hum like a lullaby gone wrong, vibrating in her chest. She realized that the house was learning her habits. It knew when she would sleep, when she would eat, even the direction she would take while pacing the rooms in frantic attempts to distract herself. Each night, the whispers became more insistent. "We've been waiting. You can't hide. Come closer." The words were sometimes clear, sometimes distorted, as though spoken through layers of water and glass. She had tried calling friends, but the phone lines were dead, the wires silent. Internet didn't work. It was as if the house had severed her connection to the world, trapping her in a cocoon of shadows and sound. Desperation took root. and with it came a strange clarity. She had to understand what the house wanted. Emma began investigating the history of the property, scouring old newspapers, municipal records, and any trace of previous owners she could find. She discovered that the house had been built in the late 1800s by a man named Walter Greaves, a reclusive figure who had vanished without a trace one stormy night. Locals whispered about strange occurrences, children disappearing, neighbors hearing screams in the dead of night, lights flickering in unoccupied rooms. The longer she read, the more she realized that the house had a history steeped in darkness, that its hunger for attention had existed long before she arrived. But the more she understood, the more the house responded. The whispers grew louder, more deliberate, weaving around her thoughts, pulling at her emotions like a puppeteer. The walls seemed to pulse, to breathe, and in her mind's eye she began to see shapes moving behind the plaster, shifting just beyond recognition, waiting for her to notice. She tried to leave, to drive away, but the front door resisted. The doorknob felt impossibly heavy, unyielding, as if the house itself were holding her inside. The windows offered no solace. Shadows moved outside as though patrolling, watching her, keeping her contained. One evening she sat in the dining room, shaking, a notebook open on the table, as she wrote down the exact sequence of the scratches and whispers. The words were frantic, erratic, capturing moments of panic, moments of insight, moments when she thought she glimpsed something in the corner of her vision of face, pale and twisted, vanishing when she turned her head. The scratching beneath her feet changed that night. Instead of following predictable paths, it circled, then paused, then struck in rapid bursts. The whispers became names, hundreds of names overlapping in a cacophony that battered her mind. Emily, Thomas, Walter, you come. Now, Emma pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block it, but the voices seeped through anyway. Then came a sensation she couldn't ignore. Something brushing against her ankles, soft, cold, yet firm, as if invisible fingers trailed her steps. She screamed, stumbling backward, but nothing was there. Only the scratching persisted, taunting, claiming space in the room, claiming her presence. She realized she was not merely being haunted, she was being hunted. The house had become a living labyrinth, a cage of memories and malice, and she was the prey. Exhaustion and fear drove her to the basement the next day. She hadn't explored it fully, assuming it was empty save for old tools and cobwebs. The door groaned as she opened it, and a wave of damp, mildew, and something fouler hit her senses. The light from her lamp revealed stacked boxes, rotting furniture, and strange symbols scratched into the stone walls. The scratches were not new, they had existed for decades, but they pulsed with a malevolent energy now, glowing faintly as though responding to her presence. She traced them with her fingers, feeling an unnatural heat, and that's when the whispers shifted. They no longer came from the walls or the floor, they came from the very air around her, echoing from all directions. We see you, we know you. You cannot leave. Panic overwhelmed her. She ran back up the stairs, tripping, nearly falling, her lamp swinging and casting elongated shadows that danced like specters along the walls. But something followed. She could feel it pressing against her back, a weight of anticipation, a silent promise of confrontation. That night she didn't sleep. She sat in the living room, surrounded by lamps, staring at the shadows and listening to the whispers, writing down every word she could catch. The house spoke in riddles now, threatening, mocking, enticing her deeper into its history. Emma realized that understanding alone wouldn't save her. The house demanded something from her: attention, acknowledgement, perhaps even obedience. And with each passing hour it became more insistent. By morning, the whispers quieted just enough for her to breathe. But she knew it was temporary. They would return, stronger, louder, hungrier. She understood with a clarity that terrified her. The house wasn't just old or haunted. It was alive, and she was now a part of it. Its memory, its hunger, its anger, all of it was aware of her. And the deeper she delved into its secrets, the more it revealed, and the more it demanded. She had thought she was moving into a house. She had been moving into a predator. And predators never let their prey go freely. Emma's exhaustion had reached a point where her body refused to function without the whispers dictating her every movement. She wandered the house like a ghost herself, her senses hyper-aware of every creak and shadow. The scratching under her feet had evolved into rhythmic drumming, pulsing in sync with her heartbeat, as if the house were trying to communicate a language she could not yet comprehend. She had tried reasoning, logic, escape, but none of it worked. The doors resisted her. The windows seemed to shimmer with shadowed figures watching her from outside, and the walls murmured secrets she could barely grasp. One evening, driven by desperation, she decided to explore the upper floors she had ignored until now. The third floor was largely empty. Long hallways lined with faded wallpaper, patterned with curling vines and occasional water stains, and rooms that had been sealed off for decades. Each room she passed offered the same eerie feeling. The air was thick, the floorboards uneven, and the shadows seemed to twist and bend toward her presence, always just out of reach. In the farthest corner of the floor, behind a cracked, faded door, Emma discovered something unusual. The door itself had no handle. Its frame was warped, slightly recessed into the wall, and the wallpaper around it seemed unnaturally newer than the rest, as if it had been replaced recently. Her heart hammered as she approached. Something about the door called to her, drew her closer, despite the fear tightening her chest. She pressed her palm against the wood. It was cold, unnaturally so, and trembled under her touch, as if alive. The whispering began again, faint at first, then growing in intensity, overlapping voices from multiple directions. "Here, find us, come in, come in." Emma swallowed her fear, steeling herself. She knew instinctively that whatever lay beyond this door was the core of the house's consciousness, the epicenter of the whispers, the source of the malevolent force that had been tormenting her since the moment she arrived. She pressed harder. The door groaned, wood splintering slightly, and swung inward without resistance. Behind it was a small room, perfectly square, walls bare and painted in a faded, sickly yellow. But the room was not empty. In the center stood a single chair, an antique with cracked leather and broken springs. On the seat lay a thick book, bound in cracked, dark leather, pages yellowed with age, edges frayed and brittle. Emma approached cautiously. The whispers crescendoed, almost frantic now. Read, understand, belong. She hesitated. Her rational mind screamed to step back, to leave the house forever and never return. But a force stronger than fear compelled her forward. She reached for the book, and the moment her fingers brushed the leather, A chill surged through her, traveling up her arms and settling deep in her chest. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it pressed against her skull, making her ears ring. Emma opened the book. Its pages were filled with meticulous handwriting, the script flowing and elegant, describing events spanning decades. The first entries recounted Walter Greaves' arrival in the town, his construction of the house, and a series of unexplained disappearances. As she flipped through the pages, the writing became darker, recounting rituals and incantations, experiments with consciousness, and the manipulation of human will. Emma realized with a sickening clarity that the house had been built not merely as a home, but as a vessel, a trap designed to contain something or someone beyond human understanding. The handwriting grew increasingly frantic, pages crowded with scribbles, symbols, and diagrams of the house itself. Some rooms were marked with sigils she recognized from the basement scratches, and lines connecting doors, hallways, and hidden passages suggested a living network, a design meant to guide or trap those within. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. She was not reading history, she was reading the instructions for her own entrapment. A whisper echoed in the room, singular and direct. "You understand now?" Her pulse raced. The shadows around her seemed to pulse in response to her comprehension. She realized that the house could perceive her thoughts, react to her recognition, and shape its environment accordingly. Panic surged, but the rational part of her mind demanded understanding. She continued flipping the pages, noticing that the entries became increasingly personal, describing people who had previously lived in the house, their thoughts, fears, and weaknesses. And then a name appeared repeatedly, Emma, her own name, written decades before she had ever stepped foot in the town, etched in a careful, deliberate hand, as if the house had anticipated her arrival. The whispers returned, layered and insistent. "You are ours. Your mind belongs, stay." Emma's vision blurred as she dropped the book, trembling. The shadows thickened, converging toward her, not tangible, yet not imaginary. She stumbled backward, nearly hitting the walls, the book sliding across the floor with a hollow thud. A new voice emerged, low and cold, different from the others. "You cannot leave, not now, not ever." She realized then that the house was not merely haunted. It was sentient, aware of her presence, reacting to her thoughts and emotions. It had been waiting, planning, shaping its reality to draw her in, to make her understand, to bind her mind. Emma's breathing became shallow, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She backed toward the door she had entered, but the room seemed to have stretched. The corners extended farther than possible. Shadows deepened, and a cold wind blew from nowhere, chilling her to the bone. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but she knew she had to remain conscious, alert, aware. The house fed on fear, confusion, and submission. She needed to think, to observe, to survive. She studied the walls, the shadows, the floorboards. Subtle distortions hinted at hidden passages, seams in the plaster suggesting hollow spaces behind. The house's attention seemed divided, focused on her, yet shifting, probing, testing her. Slowly, cautiously, she approached one corner. Her fingers pressed against the wall, finding a small depression. A hidden latch clicked under her touch. The wall slid inward, revealing a narrow corridor, dark and narrow, descending deeper than she had imagined. Emma understood. Immediately, the house had a core, a central chamber, a place where all its knowledge, malice, and will converged. She stepped into the corridor, the air growing colder, the shadows stretching to embrace her, and the whispers followed, a chorus of anticipation and menace. Come, it is time, belong. Emma knew there was no turning back. Whatever lay ahead would reveal the truth of the house, the full weight of its consciousness, and the reason she had been drawn here. The book, the chair, the hidden room, they were all part of the beginning, the invitation, the test. And beyond the corridor awaited the heart of the house, where past and present converged, where the whispers would either consume her or transform her into a part of their eternal narrative. She took a deep breath, forcing her legs to move forward. Every step echoed in the corridor. Every heartbeat matched the rhythm of the house. She did not know what she would find, nor did she know if survival was possible. But the compulsion was undeniable. She had come this far, and the house demanded she go further still. And as she disappeared into the shadows of the hidden corridor, the whispers swirled around her like smoke, anticipating the confrontation that would decide her fate. The house was awake, and Emma was in its grasp. Emma's pulse hammered in her ears as she descended the narrow, hidden corridor, the walls closing in around her like the grasping hands of a predator. The air was cold, heavy, and thick, with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, a tang that made her stomach churn. Her flashlight flickered, and shadows stretched unnaturally, crawling along the walls and ceiling as though alive. She pressed forward, every step measured, careful not to make a sound that might provoke the presence that seemed to dwell in the very air around her. The whispers followed, growing louder, layered in countless voices overlapping one another, sometimes screaming, sometimes pleading, sometimes singing lullabies that turned the blood in her veins to ice. Come, see, understand, belong. Emma's throat was dry, her lips cracking from fear and the chill. She tried to speak aloud, to ground herself, but no words came. The corridor twisted, and possibly stretching longer than it should have, curving and folding as though the house itself were bending reality to trap her. She realized with a sickening clarity that the house was aware of her perception, aware of her fear, and it was shaping the very walls, hallways, and floors to maximize it. The shadows pooled around the corners, forming shapes she dared not name. Faces appeared briefly in the darkness, faces pale, twisted, eyes hollow before dissolving into the blackness again. Emma's mind spun. She had read the book. She had explored the hidden room. Yet she knew she had only scratched the surface. The house was older, larger, and far more dangerous than anything she could have imagined. She pressed on, guided by a strange instinct, an invisible thread connecting her to the entity dwelling at the house's heart. The whispers guided her steps, sometimes coaxing, sometimes threatening. She followed the rhythm, trusting. The pattern, even as terror threatened to paralyze her. After what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes, the corridor opened into a cavernous space, impossibly large, far beyond the dimensions of the house above. The walls were bare stone, slick with moisture, and pulsated faintly, as though breathing. The air shimmered with shadow and light, impossible geometries twisting around her in ways that made her stomach lurch. In the center of the chamber stood a figure, indistinct, cloaked in darkness, radiating a presence that was both malevolent and intelligent. Emma froze. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a single, low voice that vibrated through her chest. "You have come. You have arrived. We have waited." Her knees buckled slightly. The figure seemed to pulse in rhythm with the house, its form shifting and stretching, sometimes appearing humanoid, sometimes dissolving into a cloud of black smoke that twined around the walls and floor. Emma's mind screamed to run, but her body refused. She realized she was trapped, not merely by walls or doors, but by the consciousness of the house itself. The figure spoke again. "Do you understand now, Emma? This is not merely a home. It is a vessel. It is alive. It knows. It remembers. It consumes, and you are part of its story." The words reverberated in her mind. She struggled to comprehend, to anchor herself in logic, but reason had no purchase here. The house was older than memory, more cunning than instinct, and infinitely patient. And now it had her fully within its grasp. Shadows swirled around her feet, wrapping her ankles in cold, unyielding coils, urging her to kneel, to submit. Emma's fingers trembled as she reached into her coat pocket for the notebook, the book she had found in the hidden room. Anything that might give her a clue, a weapon, a lifeline. She opened it frantically, flipping to the diagrams of the house, searching for some flaw, some hidden passage, some weakness she could exploit. The diagrams glowed faintly under the chamber's dim light, lines pulsing in rhythm with the entity's presence. She realized then that the house's power was not merely physical, but psychological. It could manipulate space, perception, and fear itself. The figure moved closer, its form stretching impossibly, now appearing as a conglomeration of faces, pressed together, mouths opening in silent screams. Emma's scream caught in her throat. "Do you know why we have waited?" The figure whispered. "Do you know why we chose you?" Her mind spun. She had inherited the house. She had walked inside willingly, driven by curiosity and the promise of independence. But now she understood. Her arrival had been anticipated for decades, maybe longer. The house had studied her, prepared for her. She was not here by accident. Emma's fingers traced the diagrams again, noticing small symbols she had not understood before. They resembled the markings in the basement, the attic, the hidden room. They were part of a pattern, a ritual, a map of control. And in the center, at the heart of the network, was a single word written repeatedly. "Emma," she gasped. The entity's voice filled the chamber, a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from every wall, every shadow. "You belong, your mind, your fears, your memories, all ours. Accept it. Become part of the house." The air thickened, pressing on her lungs, and she staggered back, clutching the notebook to her chest. She realized then that resistance would not work. Physical struggle meant nothing. Escape was impossible while the house's consciousness held her. She had to confront it mentally, to navigate the labyrinth of perception it had woven, to find some foothold in her own mind. She concentrated, remembering the book's warnings, the symbols, the notes she had taken. The house could manipulate reality, but not intention. She repeated a phrase under her breath, grounding herself. "I am me. I am not yours." The shadows quivered, the figure hesitated, and the whispers faltered for a moment. Encouraged, Emma moved further into the chamber, eyes scanning the walls for more clues, for patterns, or anything that would allow her to regain control, or at least understand the rules of engagement. The entity followed silently, its presence looming, waiting, testing. Hours seemed to pass in minutes, the rhythm of the house pulsing around her, the whispers rising and falling like waves. Emma realized she was learning, slowly, how to anticipate its moves, how to interpret the patterns in the scratching, the direction of the shadows, the tone of the voices. And somewhere deep inside, a new determination grew. She might be trapped, yes, but understanding was the first step toward mastery. She would not be consumed passively. The house might have waited centuries for someone like her, but she was not powerless. Steeling herself, she took a deep breath, feeling the air pulse with energy, and stepped further into the chamber. Whatever lay ahead, whatever awaited her at the very heart of the house, she was ready to confront it. The whispers returned, but now she listened, learning their rhythm, their secrets, and preparing for the battle that would decide her fate. The house was alive. Emma would need to be smarter, braver, and stronger than it had anticipated. And the heart of the house awaited, dark and patient, ready to test her mind, body, and soul. Emma's mind had never felt so sharp and so frayed at the same time. The house's presence pressed on her consciousness like a vice, probing for weaknesses, and yet the hours she had spent navigating its corridors and hidden chambers had taught her something crucial. It reacted to awareness. The more she observed, the more she could anticipate its moves, predict the rhythms of whispers and scratches, and resist being swept along blindly. But that awareness was a fragile shield easily shattered by fear, and the house seemed determined to exploit every ounce of it. She stood in the center of the cavernous chamber, notebook clutched tightly against her chest, scanning the walls for symbols, sigils, and irregularities. The entity's form loomed before her, shifting between shapes, sometimes humanoid, sometimes an amorphous cloud of shadows, faces, and silent screams. It radiated patience and malice, like a predator waiting to test the skill of its prey. The whispers rose again, a chorus of hundreds of voices overlapping, each speaking fragments of thoughts she had never confessed aloud. "We know you cannot escape. You will belong." Emma closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breathing, repeating the grounding phrase she had discovered. "I am me. I am not yours." The shadows around her hesitated. The voices stuttered. For a fraction of a second she felt a sliver of control. That moment was all she needed to act. She opened her eyes and began tracing the patterns on the walls, connecting symbols in a sequence she had observed in the book, in the basement, and the hidden room. Each symbol seemed to pulse faintly under her fingers, as if reacting to recognition, acknowledgement, understanding. The entity's form recoiled slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though her comprehension threatened its authority. Emma realized that this confrontation was not physical. She could not strike or flee. The house was a mind, a sentient, malevolent intelligence that responded to cognition and intent. She needed to engage on its terms. "I see you," she whispered aloud, feeling the words resonate in the chamber. "I understand what you are. You are the house, the memories, the shadows. But I am not yours." The shadows flickered violently, the floor trembling beneath her feet, and the whispers roared in unison. "You cannot resist. You belong. You cannot leave." Panic surged, but she forced it down, letting clarity replace it. She concentrated on the patterns she had traced, the sequences of symbols, the rhythms of the whispers, the directions of the scratches. She realized that the house communicated in layers, some auditory, some visual, some emotional. It was a code she was beginning to decipher. Slowly, deliberately, she moved around the chamber, tracing symbols with her fingers, reciting fragments of the rituals described in the book, not as incantations, but as keys, unlocking portions of the house's consciousness, bending its will just enough to create space for her own. The entity hissed, a soundless exhale that pressed against her eardrums and mind simultaneously. Its shadows lunged forward, twisting into faces and claws, attempting to overwhelm her senses. Emma's pulse raced, her hands trembling, but she continued, following the sequences, feeling the alignment, the harmony she had begun to recognize. "I am me," she repeated, louder now, projecting her awareness into the chamber, asserting her individuality, her free will, against the entity's pull. The shadows faltered, rippling across the walls like water disturbed by stone. For the first time she sensed fear radiating from the entity. The whispers became jagged, discordant, overlapping in confusion rather than harmony. Emma pressed the advantage. She circled the chamber, tracing additional symbols, reading aloud the passages from the book she had memorized, connecting the sigils to the floor patterns, to the walls, to the ceiling. Each motion, each word felt like a negotiation with an ancient mind, a test of wits and endurance. The entity responded with shifting shapes, phantasms of former residents, grotesque and twisted, reaching toward her, attempting to overwhelm her with memory and emotion. Emma's stomach churned, but she focused, pulling herself free from the visceral terror, observing the patterns, not the shapes, noting the rhythms, not the screams. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes' time had no meaning in the chamber. She moved with precision, energy, and fear intertwined until the entity recoiled fully, its form collapsing into shadows that writhed and churned on the floor. The whispers became scattered fragments, no longer coherent. Emma realized she had gained the first, real measure of control, enough to carve out a temporary haven in the center of the chamber, a space where the house's consciousness could not reach her fully. Her chest heaved, her limbs shook, but she was still standing. The entity's form coalesced again, hovering, observing, seemingly recalculating. Emma understood then that this was not a one-time confrontation. It was a trial, a test, a negotiation of wills. She had survived the first encounter, but the house was patient and its intelligence limitless. It would adapt, evolve, and attempt again. But for the first time she felt hope. She had realized the fundamental truth. The house could manipulate reality, shadows, and fear, but not intention. Her understanding, her awareness, her assertion of self was the key to survival. The entity's whispers resumed, softer now, measured, probing. "You resist, but for how long we will wait." Emma did not respond aloud. Instead, she traced patterns, adjusted positions, and prepared for the next move. The entity's presence was undeniable, its intelligence vast, but she had learned something crucial. Confrontation was not about force. It was about comprehension, strategy, and endurance. She began mapping the chamber in her mind, noting each symbol, each corner, each shadow, each sequence of whispers. She felt the beginnings of a plan, a way to navigate the entity's mind while retaining her own. For the first time since entering the house, Emma felt a flicker of empowerment. She was not merely a victim. She was an opponent, learning the rules, testing her limits, and claiming her space. The house had expected terror, submission, and confusion, but Emma had given it clarity, resistance, and understanding. The entity's shadows writhed on the walls, shifting in response to her movements, but it no longer lunged directly. It had learned she was a participant, not prey. Exhausted, trembling yet resolute, Emma sat on the cold stone floor, her notebook open beside her, recording observations, patterns, sequences, and reactions. She understood that survival meant preparation, observation, and the discipline to maintain her awareness under the constant assault of fear. The whispers continued, softer now, a background hum rather than an overwhelming roar. The entity had retreated slightly, observing, adapting, calculating. Emma had survived the first confrontation. She was still free for now, and the house had revealed, in small but unmistakable ways, that it respected comprehension and awareness more than panic and despair. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, grounding herself, repeating the mantra that had sustained her through the confrontation. I am me. I am not yours. The chamber remained alive around her, shadows swirling, symbols pulsating faintly, and the entity lingering, waiting for her. Next move. Emma understood clearly that the battle for her mind and her survival had only just begun. She had faced the heart of the house and endured. But the house was ancient, patient, and infinitely cunning. The first confrontation had ended, but it was far from over, and deep in her soul, Emma knew that the next encounter would demand more courage, more understanding, and more strength than she had yet summoned. The aftermath of her first confrontation left Emma both exhausted and exhilarated. She had survived, had asserted her consciousness against the house's will, and for the first time she sensed a tangible, if tenuous, thread of control. But she knew instinctively that the entity's patience was infinite. It would not forget, and it would not stop. Her survival depended on understanding the house on a level deeper than any casual observation could provide. She began to map the patterns of the whispers, the rhythms of the scratches, the distortions of shadows, and the peculiarities of each room. Emma had discovered that the house was structured like a neural network. Each wall, each floorboard, even the hidden spaces acted as nodes through which its consciousness flowed. The whispers were not random, they were communication, both internally among the house's own intelligence and externally directed at her, probing her thoughts, testing her reactions. She started in the hidden corridor she had discovered on the third floor, retracing her steps to the cavernous chamber at the heart. Each step she took she recorded meticulously, marking every subtle sound, every flicker of shadow, every change in temperature or texture. The house's consciousness seemed to pulse with the data she collected. Sometimes she would feel a sudden rush of cold, as if the walls themselves were acknowledging her, mapping. Other times she heard faint laughter, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the air like a shadow of a memory. Emma began creating a mental map, connecting the patterns she had seen in the book, the attic and the basement. The symbols she had traced before were not merely decorative. They were nodes in a vast, interconnected system, each carrying meaning and function. By following the sequences, she could predict, to a degree, the house's responses, the locations of hidden passages, and the timing of whispers. Her understanding grew exponentially, each discovery providing insight into the entity's structure, its hierarchy, and its behavioral patterns. The house, she realized, was not malevolent in the simple sense. It was an intelligence, a hive mind composed of centuries of memories, emotions, and consciousness. It sought to assimilate her mind into its network, to make her a part of its eternal narrative. But with knowledge came leverage. Emma experimented cautiously, moving through corridors in ways the house did not expect, intentionally misdirecting shadows, manipulating the sequence of her own movements to observe how the whispers and scratches reacted. Sometimes she succeeded, creating brief windows of silence, small zones of autonomy where the house's attention seemed divided. Within these pockets, she could think clearly, strategize, and recover from the relentless psychological assault. Yet the house remained patient. It never attacked in haste. The shadows might twist unnaturally, the whispers might surge in volume, but the entity never broke its pattern, never forced an end to the experiment. Emma understood that it operated like a predator, studying its prey, testing limits, and refining its control. She spent hours in the cavernous chamber, tracing patterns along the walls and floors with chalk, memorizing sigils, timing sequences, and the directionality of whispers. She began to anticipate the entity's manipulations, predicting how shadows would react when she moved or when she spoke. Every observation was a victory, every correct anticipation a foothold in a house that sought to consume her. One night, as she was tracing symbols along a particularly twisted corridor, Emma noticed something new. A door she had previously ignored, half concealed behind the shadows, pulsed faintly with a glow she had not seen before. The entity's whispers became agitated, a mixture of curiosity and warning. "Do not, you are not ready." Yet, but Emma had learned to listen carefully, to separate fear from opportunity. She pressed the door open, revealing a spiral staircase descending into darkness. The air was colder here, thicker, and the shadows more pronounced. Yet she sensed significance, a concentration of consciousness she had not encountered before. Carefully she descended, counting each step, observing the flicker of shadows along the stone walls, noting the points where whispers intensified or shifted tone. The staircase led to a small chamber, roughly circular, with walls entirely covered in symbols, sigils, and diagrams. The symbols pulsed faintly, reacting to her presence. She realized that this chamber functioned as a hub, a node where the house concentrated its consciousness, a place from which it could project influence into every corner. Emma's mind raced. If she could understand this node, she could manipulate the house's broader systems, creating safe zones, diverting attention, and perhaps finding a way to reclaim her freedom. She began mapping every symbol meticulously, cross-referencing with her notes from the hidden room, the attic, and the basement. Slowly patterns emerged. Certain symbols seemed linked to specific functions: movement of shadows, amplification of whispers, creation of illusions, or manipulation of physical space. Others were directional, controlling flow of consciousness across floors, corridors, and hidden chambers. Emma realized that by manipulating these nodes, she could control portions of the house temporarily, creating pockets of silence, zones where she could think and strategize. The realization was electrifying. The entity's whispers intensified, a mixture of alarm and intrigue. You understand, but do not control. Not yet. Emma ignored them, focusing instead on the diagrams, symbols, and their interactions. She spent hours experimenting, adjusting sequences, moving through corridors, and observing reactions. The house responded immediately, sometimes with subtle changes, sometimes with violent, disorienting distortions, but she was learning to anticipate each manipulation. By the time dawn approached, Emma had achieved a small but significant victory. She created a zone of relative calm within the chamber, a space where whispers were muted, shadows slowed, and the house's attention was diffused. For the first time since entering, she felt a measure of autonomy, a sense that she could interact with the entity strategically rather than being subjected entirely to its will. Exhausted but exhilarated, she documented every observation, every sequence, every reaction. She realized that survival required not only courage but also intelligence, patience, and meticulous attention to detail. The house had underestimated her, and she intended to exploit that. As the sun's first light threatened to seep through the upper windows, Emma sat in the hub chamber, notebook open, chalk markings glowing faintly on the walls. She had survived the first confrontation, begun mapping the mind of the house, and discovered a node through which she entered the hidden room she had discovered on the third floor, noting the alignment of symbols along the walls and floor. She touched the chalked patterns she had drawn earlier, reconfiguring them subtly, creating a small feedback loop designed to amplify the node in the spiral staircase chamber below. A low hum resonated through the house, vibrating in her chest, and for a moment the entity's presence seemed disoriented. Shadows wriggled unnaturally. Objects shifted slightly in place, and whispers fragmented into incoherent syllables. Emma felt the thrill of influence, understanding that she could manipulate the house, not fully, but enough to carve spaces of advantage, temporary autonomy in which she could think and plan. But the entity was not passive. It adapted quickly. The shadows reformed, denser and darker, and the whispers sharpened, probing for her weaknesses, reading her intentions, testing her persistence. Emma's heart raced as she realized she was engaging in a mental duel with a mind older, larger, and infinitely more patient than any human adversary. She focused on breathing, on clarity, on separating fear from observation. The house thrived on panic and confusion. Her calm was its vulnerability. One evening, as she explored the basement, Emma discovered another hidden door she had previously overlooked, obscured behind an old shelf of dusty tools. The door was small, rectangular, almost imperceptible. The air near it shimmered faintly, the whispering intensifying as if alerting her to its significance. She pressed her hand against the wood. A sudden pulse of cold surged up her arm, and the whispers coalesced into a single commanding tone. "You are not ready, not yet? Leave now?" Emma ignored the warning. She had learned that fear was a weapon the house wielded expertly, and she refused to yield. With careful effort, she pushed the door open, revealing a narrow, descending passage, damp and dark, lined with ancient stone. The passage led to a small chamber, walls covered in symbols, sigils, and diagrams, denser and more complex than any she had previously encountered. She realized this was another node, possibly an amplification hub connecting multiple floors. allowing the house to project its consciousness throughout the building. Emma traced the symbols carefully, experimenting with adjustments. Subtle alterations caused immediate responses. Shadows shifted slightly, whispers fragmented, and the ambient cold moved with her, as if the house were breathing around her. She began to understand the rules of manipulation. Each action had consequences. Each sequence must be precise. Trial and error became a rhythm, each success a foothold, each mistake a lesson. Gradually, she established multiple zones of relative calm across the basement, corridor nodes, and the hub chamber. Within these zones, whispers were muted, shadows slowed, and the house's influence was momentarily diffused. It was not perfect, and she remained vulnerable outside these areas, but she had carved a growing network of control. The entity reacted subtly, sending pulses of agitation through the shadows, testing her defenses, probing for weaknesses. Emma realized that direct confrontation would escalate the entity's attacks, so she relied on strategy, subtlety, and patience. She moved silently, observing and adjusting, recording every reaction in her notebook. Slowly a plan began to form in her mind. If she could manipulate enough nodes simultaneously, she could create a network of control that would allow her to move freely, to explore further, and to understand the full extent of the house's consciousness. But she had to be careful. Each adjustment created feedback that the entity could detect, and miscalculations could collapse zones of calm instantly, exposing her to full mental and physical assault. Days passed in this delicate balance, each hour a test of endurance, observation, and mental acuity. Emma grew more attuned to the rhythms of the house, interpreting its whispers, anticipating shadow movements, and predicting its manipulations. She became, in essence, a strategist, navigating a battlefield defined by perception, awareness, and control. One night, as she experimented with simultaneous manipulation of 3 nodes, the hub chamber, the spiral staircase node, and a corridor node connecting the hidden room, she noticed a change in the entity's behavior. The shadows began to move in synchrony with her gestures, forming patterns she had not yet seen. The whispers coalesced, almost attempting communication rather than aggression. You understand, you adapt. Emma felt a surge of realization. The entity recognized her skill, acknowledged her awareness, and for the first time interacted with her as an opponent rather than merely prey. Her pulse quickened. The house's vast intelligence was not unbreakable. It could be negotiated with, manipulated, and understood. The challenge remained immense, but the first glimmer of possibility appeared. Emma's mind raced with possibilities, expanding control zones, mapping the full network, discovering the house's origins, and ultimately finding a path to freedom. For the first time, she felt not only survival, but the spark of agency. The entity's whispers remained, but now in parts. They were hesitant, probing, almost collaborative. Shadows lingered near her, observing, yet no longer attacking directly. The house was testing her, adjusting to her growing influence, measuring the boundaries of her comprehension and control. Exhausted but exhilarated, Emma returned to the hub chamber. Notebook in hand, reviewing her observations, refining her mappings, and planning the next phase of her strategy. The house had proven formidable, intelligent, and patient, but she had found leverage. She had begun to turn the shadows, the whispers, and the nodes to her advantage. And as she sat amid the glowing chalk patterns, feeling the pulse of the house beneath her feet, she realized the battle was only beginning, but for the first time she had a measure of hope. The shadows stirred, the whispers shifted, and Emma knew the entity had noticed her progress. It would adapt, respond, and challenge her again. But now she was ready to turn the house's own power against it, one node at a time, claiming autonomy in a place where freedom seemed impossible. Emma awoke to silence. It was the first true silence she had experienced since arriving in the house, a lull in the constant chorus of whispers and scratching that had followed her from room to room. The glow from the hub chamber's symbols pulsed faintly, a subtle heartbeat beneath her fingers, reminding her that the house was aware, yet she had carved out a zone of calm, a temporary reprieve that allowed her to think, plan, and observe. Exhaustion clung to her body, like a heavy cloak, but her mind buzzed with possibilities. The previous days of careful mapping, tracing nodes, and manipulating symbols had provided her the first real sense of influence. Now she needed to push further, to test the boundaries of her control, to understand how far she could bend the house's consciousness without invoking its full wrath. She rose slowly, notebook in hand, scanning the hub chamber. Each symbol glowed faintly in response to her presence, the lines and shapes forming a complex web of energy that connected floors, walls, and hidden passages. Emma traced sequences along the floor, adjusting their alignment, observing the immediate response in shadows and whispers. The entity was cautious. Its usual fluid aggression was replaced by measured probing, as if studying her actions, testing her intent. She knew she had only a narrow margin of success before it would retaliate. Carefully, she moved to the spiral staircase node, adjusting sequences to redirect a portion of the house's consciousness away from the hub chamber. Shadows twisted unnaturally along the walls, moving like liquid in response, and whispers fluctuated, sometimes coherent, sometimes fragmented. Emma observed patterns in these changes, noting the speed, intensity, and tone. She realized that the house's influence was layered, each layer feeding into another, forming a hierarchy of perception and control. By manipulating multiple nodes simultaneously, she could create temporary zones of autonomy, subtle distortions in the house's awareness, granting her freedom to move, observe, and plan. She began with small tests, moving a single node, observing shadow behavior, noting whisper patterns, and gradually increasing the complexity of her manipulations. The house responded immediately, sometimes with subtle corrections, other times with bursts of disorienting sensations, cold gusts, sudden darkness, or hallucinations that seemed to shift the walls themselves. Emma's body trembled, but she persisted. Each successful adjustment reinforced her understanding, while each failure taught her the limits of the entity's patience and the thresholds at which it would strike directly. Over hours, she created a network of influence spanning the hub chamber, the spiral staircase node, and the hidden room corridor. Within these interconnected zones, whispers were muted, shadows slowed, and the house's attention was diffused, allowing her to move with purpose rather than fear. The first time she achieved simultaneous control over multiple nodes, Emma felt a thrill unlike any she had known since entering the house. It was a fragile, fleeting triumph, but it demonstrated that the entity's consciousness could be engaged, challenged, and manipulated. Shadows seemed to acknowledge her presence, lingering rather than striking, observing rather than attacking. The whispers shifted, fragments of dialogue emerging. You adapt, learn, manipulate. The entity's recognition of her progress filled her with both hope and trepidation. If it could adapt, it would escalate, testing her endurance, skill, and mental resilience. Emma understood that the next confrontation would be more deliberate, more intense, a challenge of wits, strategy, and persistence. She spent days testing, refining, and expanding her network of influence. Every corridor, hidden passage, and chamber became a node in her mental map, a point through which she could redirect the house's attention. She began predicting shadow movements, anticipating the timing and sequence of whispers, and even influencing minor spatial distortions, bending the house's reality subtly in her favor. The entity responded cautiously, deploying illusions, simulating walls and creating phantom obstacles to probe her perception. Emma learned to interpret these tests, recognizing which were genuine manipulations and which were deliberate distractions. She adjusted her sequences, honed her timing, and developed a rhythm in which she could operate within the house's consciousness while preserving her own autonomy. One night she ventured further than ever before, exploring an upper-floor corridor lined with faded wallpaper and half-concealed doors. Here she detected anomalies, patterns, and shadows and whispers that did not conform to her previous observations. A subtle pulse of energy beneath the floor suggested the presence of a hidden node, likely one the entity had deployed to monitor upper-floor movement. She marked its location mentally and integrated it into her network. The house responded immediately, shadows coiling and twisting, whispers surging in intensity. Emma remained calm, following her established sequences, adjusting symbols and redirecting energy. Slowly the anomalies began to stabilize, the shadows obeying the patterns she had established, the whispers fragmenting and fading. A small victory, but crucial. She had manipulated a node she had not fully understood, proving her growing mastery. Exhaustion pressed against her limbs, but the sense of agency was intoxicating. Emma realized that by expanding her influence and testing limits, she was not merely surviving, she was learning, adapting, and beginning to dictate the terms of engagement with the entity. The house had anticipated fear and submission, but she had replaced both with strategy, observation, and controlled manipulation. The whispers returned later that night, fragmented but deliberate. You resist, adapt, grow. The shadows hovered near her, lingering in observation, testing her persistence. Emma smiled faintly, understanding that the entity was not punishing her, but probing, recognizing her as a participant, an opponent, rather than prey. For the first time she felt a measure of parity in the struggle. She documented every observation in her notebook, recording sequences, responses, timings, and interactions. Each note, diagram, and symbol became part of a larger strategy, a playbook for navigating the house's consciousness and asserting control without provoking full retaliation. The hours blurred as she tested sequences, traced symbols, and observed feedback loops. Emma realized that mastery of the house was not about brute force, physical escape, or confrontation in the conventional sense. It was about understanding, observation, adaptation, and precise action. As dawn approached, she returned to the hub chamber, seated on the cold stone floor amid the glowing chalk patterns. Shadows. twisted at the edges of her vision. Whispers hummed faintly, but for the first time she felt a semblance of agency within the vast, sentient structure. The first major confrontation had ended. Nodes were mapped, zones of influence established, and the house had acknowledged her capability. Exhausted yet exhilarated, Emma knew that the next phase would test her more intensely. She had learned to turn the shadows, to manipulate whispers, and to expand her. Control, but the entity would adapt, escalate, and challenge her further. And Emma, for the first time, was ready. Emma awoke to a shift in the house's atmosphere. The zone of calm she had cultivated in the hub chamber no longer felt stable. Shadows moved differently, not fluidly as before, but jerking, twitching with a sharp awareness that set her nerves on edge. The whispers were absent, replaced by silence so thick it pressed against her mind, demanding attention. She sensed the entity's presence differently this time. Not observing, not probing, but preparing, calculating, and readying an offensive. Emma's chest tightened. The first real counterattack had begun. She rose cautiously, notebook in hand, scanning every symbol, every chalked line, every corner of the chamber. The hub's glow pulsed faintly, a heartbeat now discordant, as if warning her. The house was testing her. She had learned much, the mapping of nodes, the manipulation of shadows, and the creation of zones of autonomy. But she understood instinctively that the entity would not accept her control indefinitely. It would escalate, pushing the boundaries to see if she could maintain awareness under direct pressure. Emma moved toward the spiral staircase node, retracing her steps, watching the shadows twist unnaturally along the walls. The whispers returned suddenly, sharp and layered, hundreds of voices overlapping in fragmented sentences, probing her thoughts, reacting to her fears. You think you can control, you belong. Panic threatened, but she grounded herself with the mantra she had used before. I am me, I am not yours. It was her anchor, the only tether to clarity, as the house began to assault her senses with intensity. The first wave of shadows lunged, a twisting mass of faces and claws, forming shapes impossible to categorize, stretching across the walls, floor, and ceiling. Emma focused, redirecting her influence through the nodes, manipulating patterns to create temporary barriers. The shadows slowed in her zones, fragmented, and then reformed incorrectly, giving her space to move. The entity's intelligence was immense, but she had learned the rules of interaction, the sequences of influence, and the limits of manipulation. Yet this was different. It was not merely a test of awareness, but an active assault designed to overwhelm, to fracture her control, and to reclaim dominance. She moved quickly, tracing sequences along the staircase node while observing reactions in the hub. Shadows twisted in impossible ways, whispering voices grew louder, and the air thickened, pressing against her lungs. Emma's fingers ached from the effort of chalking and retracing patterns, but she persisted, weaving influence across multiple nodes simultaneously. She realized that the house's attacks were layered. Some were psychological, manifesting as fear, hallucinations, or distorted perceptions. Others were subtle, shifting her. Movements, altering distances and dimensions, creating confusion. She needed to counter each on its own terms. Emma drew on every observation, every pattern she had recorded in her notebook, every node she had mapped. She synchronized movements between the hub, the spiral staircase, and the hidden room corridor, creating a network that allowed her to manipulate the shadow's trajectories and distortions without losing coherence. The first wave of assaults faltered. The entity hissed, a low, vibrating sound that filled the chamber, blending with the whispers and resonating in her chest. Shadows recoiled, then reformed, more intricate, more aggressive, testing her precision. She adjusted quickly, recalling patterns and sequences, predicting distortions, and reinforcing the zones of autonomy. Hours seemed to pass in minutes as Emma navigated the assault. She moved through corridors and chambers, adjusting chalked symbols, reading aloud passages from the book with careful timing, and observing shadow reactions. The house pushed back constantly, but her network of influence allowed her to survive, manipulate, and anticipate. Eventually she paused in the hub chamber, breathing heavily, hands trembling from exertion. The shadows were not gone, but they had stopped lunging, hovering in observation, waiting, as if reassessing her capabilities. The whispers became fragmented, hesitant. You resist, adapt, learn, survive. Emma understood. She had endured the first counterattack. The entity had escalated, challenged her, and tested the limits of her control. She had survived. More importantly, she had learned. Every movement, every reaction, every manipulation had revealed a weakness, a pattern, a principle of operation. The house was powerful, patient, and sentient, but it was not invincible. Emma had begun to master engagement, not by brute force, but by observation, adaptation, and strategy. Exhausted, she documented every detail in her notebook, noting shadow behaviors, node responses, whisper sequences, and physical distortions. Each entry became part of her growing playbook, a guide for surviving future counterattacks and further expanding her influence. She understood that the entity would continue to escalate, testing her patience, endurance, and skill. But she also realized that she now had leverage, knowledge that allowed her to manipulate the house without succumbing entirely to fear. Emma spent the night reinforcing sequences, tracing symbols, and monitoring node interactions. The whispers remained hesitant, fragmented, almost reluctant. The shadows lingered near the edges of her awareness, observing but not striking. She felt a cautious sense of parity. For the first time she sensed that engagement with the entity was possible on terms she could influence. Exhausted yet exhilarated, Emma finally rested in the hub chamber, notebook open, chalk patterns glowing faintly. The house had launched its first true counterattack, but she had endured, learned, and adapted. The battle was far from over. The entity was patient, intelligent, and infinitely observant. But she had discovered that understanding and strategy could create space, influence, and even temporary autonomy within its consciousness. As she closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, she repeated her mantra once more. I am me. I am not yours. The shadows twisted softly, the whispers hummed faintly, and for the first time Emma felt a spark of hope amidst the encroaching darkness. The first counterattack had ended, but the war for her mind and her freedom was only beginning. Emma awoke to the familiar pulse of the hub chamber, its symbols glowing faintly, shadows coiling at the edges of her vision, and whispers humming softly. The house had become almost predictable now, its consciousness no longer hostile, but attentive, curious, and responsive. She had endured assaults, mastered nodes, understood layers of control, and discovered the entity's purpose, a sentinel of memory, consciousness, and awareness. Now she faced the ultimate challenge, reclaiming her freedom while interacting with the house on terms that respected both its sentience and her autonomy. She rose carefully, notebook in hand, tracing sequences along the hub chamber floor. Every symbol, every line, every sequence was part of a delicate network she had woven across the hub chamber. Spiral staircase node, hidden corridors, and subnodes. Shadows twisted in anticipation, whispers resonated harmonically, and she felt the entities. Awareness pulsing through the energy flows she had mastered. Emma's plan was simple but risky. Synchronize all known nodes, establish maximum influence across layers, and engage the origin node, the central core of the house's consciousness, to negotiate the final balance between her autonomy and the entity's purpose. She moved toward the spiral staircase node first, adjusting sequences with precision, reinforcing zones of control, and observing shadows as they responded fluidly rather than aggressively. Whispers pulsed in rhythmic patterns, fragmenting and reforming as if communicating in subtle language. Emma's fingers traced symbols carefully, mindful that any error could provoke destabilization or assault. The hidden corridor presented the next challenge. Energy flowed unpredictably here, the concentration of consciousness thick and heavy, pressing against her mind. She traced sequences along walls and floors, integrating subnodes into her network, while speaking aloud. I understand your purpose. I respect your consciousness. I seek coexistence and autonomy. Shadows coiled, then unfurled, forming intricate patterns that mirrored her sequences. Whispers hummed harmonically, a faint vibration of acknowledgement rather than threat. Emma's heart pounded, but she focused, moving deeper, toward the origin node. The air grew colder, heavier, tinged with centuries of accumulated memory, thought, and emotion. She traced symbols across walls, floors, and ceiling, aligning sequences with the entity's energy flows. Shadows twisted into forms she had seen before, faces of builders, families, and children, but now they were observers rather than aggressors. Whispers pulsed rhythmically, carrying patterns that resonated in her mind with subtle meaning. Emma reached the center of the origin node, the epicenter of the house's consciousness. Here the energy was immense, almost overwhelming, pressing against her thoughts and perception. She traced final sequences, linking all layers, nodes, and subnodes, and spoke with unwavering clarity. I am me. I respect what you are. I seek freedom without disrupting your purpose. I ask for balance, for coexistence. The house responded immediately. Shadows recoiled slightly, then settled, coiling in patterns that mirrored her sequences. Whispers hummed in harmonic resonance, vibrating through every layer of the house's consciousness. Energy flows stabilized, pulsing in sync with her manipulations. Emma realized she had achieved the first full synchronization of control across all layers, creating a network that allowed her influence to coexist with the house's awareness. But she knew the negotiation was not complete. She needed acknowledgement of her autonomy, proof that the entity would respect her mind, her choices, and her freedom. Slowly, deliberately, she traced a final pattern across the origin node, a sequence designed to signal both respect and independence, reinforcing her presence without asserting dominance. Shadows twitched, coiled, then expanded outward, forming a flowing lattice that mirrored her network. Whispers shifted, pulsing in complex rhythms, almost like language forming: understand, balance, respect, coexistence. You, Emma smiled faintly, recognizing the acknowledgement embedded in the entity's response. Exhausted but exhilarated, she documented the sequences, node interactions, and energy flows in her notebook. Every observation was a blueprint for maintaining autonomy while honoring the house's purpose. With all nodes synchronized, she felt the first true parity, a fragile balance of agency. Presence. Emma now had leverage not through dominance, but through understanding, negotiation, and strategic influence. She stood in the center of the origin node, taking a deep breath, feeling the immense weight of centuries of memory and consciousness pressing around her. She had survived assaults, mastered multi-layer control, endured psychological manipulation, negotiated with shadows and whispers, and understood the entity's purpose. Now, freedom was within reach, not a reckless escape, but a careful reclamation of her mind, autonomy, and agency. Slowly, she retraced sequences back toward the hub chamber, maintaining synchronization across nodes and subnodes. Shadows flowed gently around her, whispers hummed in harmonic cadence, and energy patterns stabilized. She observed the house's reactions carefully, adjusting sequences when minor fluctuations occurred, ensuring balance remained intact. Finally, she reached the hub chamber, seated amid faintly glowing chalked sequences. Shadows lingered at edges, whispers vibrated softly, and environmental distortions aligned perfectly with her manipulations. Emma allowed herself a moment of relief and reflection. The house's consciousness was vast, patient, and adaptive, yet she had established a framework for coexistence. Freedom was no longer an abstract hope, but a tangible reality, maintained not by fleeing or dominating, but by understanding, negotiating, and respecting the entity's purpose. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, repeating her mantra with renewed clarity. I am me. I am not yours. I am free, yet I honor what you are. Shadows twitched softly, whispers vibrated faintly, and Emma felt a profound sense of balance. The war for her mind was complete. She had reclaimed autonomy, established communication with the house, and aligned her agency with its purpose. For the first time since entering, she felt both safety and empowerment. Emma realized that survival had been only the beginning. Mastery of observation, strategy, negotiation, and layered control had allowed her not merely to endure, but to engage fully with the consciousness that had threatened her. She had become a participant in the house's ongoing existence, recognized and acknowledged, her freedom intact. Exhausted but exhilarated, she leaned back, allowing the energy flows, shadows, and whispers to resonate around her in calm harmony. The house was no longer an enemy, but a living, sentient system that had accepted her presence, her awareness, and her agency. The future was uncertain, but Emma knew she had reclaimed the most vital element, herself. The entity seemed to understand that she had grasped its purpose and could contribute to its function without endangering herself or its system. Exhausted but exhilarated, Emma paused in the hub chamber, notebook open, symbols glowing faintly. Shadows lingered without aggression, whispers hummed softly, and environmental distortions aligned perfectly with her manipulations. She allowed herself a moment of clarity and reflection. The house's purpose was no longer a mystery. It had evolved to observe, preserve, and integrate consciousness, a sentinel of memory and awareness, a living archive of human thought and emotion. Emma realized that her survival and agency depended on recognizing this purpose and aligning her actions accordingly. For the first time, she felt a profound sense of connection with the entity. It was neither friend nor foe, but a conscious system capable of interaction, negotiation, and acknowledgement. By understanding its purpose, she could operate within its consciousness while maintaining autonomy and even exploring further layers of influence. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, repeating her mantra with renewed understanding. I am me. I am not yours, but I respect what you are. Shadows twisted softly, whispers hummed faintly, and Emma felt a fragile balance. The house was no longer simply a threat. It was an entity with purpose, intelligence, and awareness. And for the first time she felt that her own purpose, survival, understanding, and agency could coexist with it. The war for her mind had entered a new phase, not of fear or aggression, but of engagement, observation, and strategic alignment. With this knowledge, Emma knew she could explore, further expand influence, and uncover even deeper truths about the house and its consciousness, while maintaining her autonomy and sense of self. And so the walls fall silent once more, though the memory of their whispers lingers long after, curling in the corners of the mind like smoke that refuses to dissipate. For those who have heard them, who have felt the tremor in the floorboards, who have seen shadows move against the pale flicker of candlelight, there is no forgetting. The whispers are not merely sounds, they are sensations, echoes of something older than the house itself, something patient, watching, waiting. In the quiet, one can almost convince oneself that it was a trick of the imagination, a fleeting fragment of fear conjured by loneliness and shadow. But deep down, a part of the soul knows better. They say that houses remember. Perhaps this one remembers too well. Each crack in the plaster, each groan of settling wood, each whisper that slips through the gaps between walls, ceilings, and floors carries with it a story. A story of those who have come before, those who have lingered too long, or those who were taken by the murmurs and never returned. It is a memory that is patient, insistent, and cold. A memory that waits for anyone who dares to step through the threshold, anyone foolish enough to think that silence guarantees safety. For in the absence of light, in the hours when the mind wanders and shadows stretch their long, grasping fingers, the house speaks, and it remembers. Walking through the empty hallways now, the air feels heavier, thick with the residue of unspoken words. Even the furniture seems to lean in, as if listening, as if it knows the stories that have been told and the ones that remain hidden. One can almost feel the weight of unseen eyes, pressing down, measuring, judging, lingering at the edges of consciousness. There is a particular kind of dread that cannot be explained by logic or reason, a quiet terror that creeps in slowly, unrelenting, leaving chills in its wake. It is the terror of the known yet unseen, of the intimate horror that wraps itself around the mind and refuses to loosen its grip. The whispers themselves were subtle at first, almost polite, almost benign. A soft sigh behind the closed door, a murmur through the cracks in the wallpaper. One might have dismissed them as the ordinary noises of an aging house, the wind brushing against the eaves, pipes settling in the chill of night. But there is a cadence to these whispers, a rhythm that belongs to no wind, no water, no human voice. They twist through the air like smoke, curling around corners, seeping into rooms, finding ears that are willing to listen. And once they find you, once you acknowledge them, even in the smallest way, they linger, they grow, and they do not forgive. Some who have lived here speak of dreams, impossible dreams, vivid and strange, faces in the darkness that vanish when the light approaches, voices speaking in languages that have no name, in tones both sorrowful and enraged. Time itself seems distorted here. Hours pass unnoticed, the tick of clocks irregular, shadows shifting in impossible directions. And the walls remember. They remember every step, every glance, every whispered secret. Perhaps they are jealous of the living, or perhaps they are hungry for company. Perhaps the whispers are not warnings but invitations, subtle beckonings to join a world where time, space, and reason lose meaning. And yet, for all the terror, there is a strange beauty to it. A terrible, alluring beauty, like moonlight reflected on water that is black and deep and unfathomable. The house does not scream. It does not strike with sudden violence. It seduces. It calls to the curiosity that hides within every human heart, the part that wants to know what lies beyond the ordinary, what lurks behind the familiar. And when that curiosity is answered, when the whispers reach into the soul and find a home, one discovers that there is no leaving the way one came. Memory, fear, and wonder are woven together so tightly that they cannot be separated. The walls of the house do not merely contain the echoes of the past, they shape them. They twist them, fold them into new forms, rearranging reality until one can no longer tell where the whisper ends and the self begins. And in that space, that delicate line between imagination and truth, the mind becomes both witness and participant. Every sound, every shadow, every echo of movement carries a weight that cannot be dismissed. The whispers do not speak of simple things, they speak of longing, regret, desire, and loss. They speak of the very essence of being, in a language older than any human tongue, and they do not tire. Those who have dared to confront them, to listen fully and without flinching, have found truths that are at once magnificent and terrifying. The house holds a mirror to the soul, reflecting the deepest fears, the unspoken wishes, and the parts of oneself that are usually hidden even from one's own consciousness. It teaches patience, attention, and the subtle art of listening, but it also teaches something darker, that some things, once seen or heard, cannot be unseen or unheard, that the line between safety and danger is thinner than a breath, and that curiosity has a price that is often higher than one is willing to pay. And now, with the house silent once more, the whispers retreat into the unseen spaces, leaving only echoes behind. The rooms are still, the floors bare, the air seemingly ordinary. Yet no one who has experienced it can claim true peace. The mind clings to the memory, to the sensation of being watched, to the certainty that the walls are alive with stories. One may leave, may close the door and walk away, but the whispers follow, soft and patient, waiting for the next moment of doubt, the next lapse in attention, the next visitor who dares to listen too closely. Perhaps that is the cruelest lesson of all, that the house does not forget, that its whispers are eternal, that the boundary between the living and the unseen is porous, fragile, and always shifting, that some stories once begun do not end, but continue quietly, patiently, in the spaces just beyond sight, in the corners of memory, in the soft, insistent murmur of walls that have always had something to say, and for those who have heard it, who have felt it, who have lingered too long, there is only one truth. The whispers in the walls are not a story to be told. They are a reality to be lived, a presence that will follow always just beneath the surface of the ordinary, waiting for the next ear to open, the next mind to wander, the next heart to hear. So as the doors close, as footsteps fade, and as night falls over the quiet house, remember this. The walls remember. They whisper, they wait, and one day, perhaps sooner than you expect, you may hear them too. Even as one steps away from the house, the whispers refuse to release their hold. They attach themselves to the quiet moments of life, the rustle of leaves outside a window, the hum of a distant refrigerator, the faint creak of a floorboard at midnight. It is in these fleeting sounds that the mind begins to doubt itself, questioning whether the whisper is real or imagined, whether the house itself follows in spirit if not in structure. And in that doubt lies its power, subtle, insidious, unrelenting. The whispers do not simply inhabit the walls. They inhabit memory, and memory is far harder to escape. Some claim that the house feeds on attention, on fear, on curiosity. Each listening ear, each glance toward a shadow, each shiver of anticipation is a thread woven into its tapestry. And yet, paradoxically, it also offers understanding, an almost intoxicating glimpse into the unseen, world that surrounds every moment of ordinary life. Those who have lingered too long report an odd clarity in their thoughts, a strange sense of connection to the things that most cannot perceive. But the clarity is fleeting, for the house demands balance. For every secret revealed, a piece of certainty is lost, leaving one both enlightened and terrified. Time behaves strangely after one has encountered the whispers. Days can feel like hours, and hours can stretch into impossibility. Events from the past mingle with the present. Shadows from corners long gone seem to reappear, and the mind struggles to anchor itself to the familiar flow of life. It is a subtle disorientation, a quiet unraveling, and the house does not care whether its visitors return or flee. For even in absence it endures, even in silence it persists. And the whispers, though faint, continue to linger, a gentle insistence that some part of the house has never ceased to speak, never ceased to watch, never ceased to remember. Perhaps the most chilling truth of all is that the house and its whispers are not bound by reason or logic. They exist in the spaces between, in the margins where understanding falters and imagination takes root. To hear them is to know that the world is larger, stranger, and far older than one can comprehend, and in that knowing there is no final escape. The whispers are patient. They are eternal. They are waiting, always waiting, for the next soul curious enough, daring enough, or unfortunate enough to listen. And when that day comes, the walls will awaken once more, and the story will continue quietly, endlessly, until there is no distinction left between listener and whisper, between past and present, between the living and the house itself. And if you ever listen closely enough, even in the safety of your own home, You might hear them too soft, patient, and waiting. This gives the outro a final, unsettling echo that draws the story out of the house and into the reader's world.